Alright children, welcome back to AP Macroeconomics with your favorite teacher, me, Mr. Fritz. Today we're going to talk about the money market. The money market is going to be just like every other supply and demand graph I've taught you so far. Down on this horizontal axis we're going to have quantity, but this time it's the quantity of money supply. And over here on the vertical axis we're going to have the price. But this time it's the price of borrowing money, which is the interest rate. And we're going to be doing the nominal interest rate, which is the interest rate without accounting for inflation. So how much you're being charged when you walk into the bank, not taking inflation into account. The money demand curve is going to be affected by the users of money. So that's going to be people like us, consumers and firms, businesses. And that money demand curve is downward sloping. Because as the interest rate decreases, so too does the opportunity cost of keeping your cash in your pocket. The opportunity cost of holding cash is the interest that you forego by keeping it outside of a savings account or some other interest-bearing asset like a bond or a certificate of deposit. As that interest rate gets higher, there is going to be an increase in your opportunity cost for keeping your cash in your pocket. You're missing out on a greater amount of interest payments walking around with it on you rather than in a savings account. And so you're going to be incentivized to save. Up here at the very tip of the money demand curve is your transaction demand for money. Because at the end of the day, we're not checking out what interest rates are looking like before we go into the grocery store. No matter how high the interest rate gets, we need to buy things like food and coffee and gas. Where the money demand and the money supply curve intersect is going to be our nominal interest rate, and we're going to label that with the lowercase I because we're going to save the uppercase I for the loanable funds market. Things that cause the money demand curve to shift. Those are going to be things that cause people like you and me to keep more cash on us or less cash on us. One of those is going to be inflation. If prices are rising to buy the same exact goods and services as I was before, I'm going to need more cash, and so money demand will increase and I will start to keep more cash on me. That's going to cause the nominal interest rate to increase, so the interest rate will be higher. It'll cost more to borrow. When I'm saying that the money demand is increasing, this is my demand or my desire to keep my own cash on my person or in my pockets rather than in an interest-bearing asset like a savings account. Other things that will cause the money demand curve to shift: if there is a change in real GDP. If there's a fall in real GDP and we go into a recession, real national income will be down, unemployment will be up, people will be buying less goods and services, and they'll need less cash. The money demand curve will decrease and shift to the left. Finally, credit cards. When people use credit cards, they're not using money. They're taking a small loan with a really high interest rate out from a corporation like Visa or MasterCard or something like that. And so when you use credit cards rather than cash, money demand is falling and shifting to the left and leading to lower interest rates. Next, I'm going to talk about what happens when the money supply curve shifts. If the money supply curve shifts, it's going to be caused by something that the Federal Reserve does. The money supply curve is straight up and down because it's controlled by the Federal Reserve. They have monopoly control on the money supply. They decide if there's going to be an increase in the money supply or a decrease in the money supply, or if we're going to maintain it and keep it the same. There are three tools of the Federal Reserve that they use to change money supply. One is the reserve requirement ratio. That's the percentage of money that's sitting in people's checking accounts that banks are not allowed to lend out. If the Fed wants banks to lend out more money, they can lower that reserve requirement ratio, which will allow banks to lend out a greater amount and make your money multiplier larger. If they want to decrease the money supply, then they can raise the reserve requirement ratio, and now banks will have to hold on to a greater percentage of the money that's sitting in people's checking accounts, and any loan that they do make will have a smaller effect because the money multiplier will be smaller. Next, they can use the discount rate. That's the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks to borrow money from the Fed. So if a commercial bank like Bank of America doesn't have enough money to cover their required reserves for the evening, they call up the Federal Reserve and ask them to borrow, and they'll borrow at the discount rate. Don't get it confused. It's not like a sale. It's just the name of the interest rate. It's the discount rate. So if the Fed wants banks to lend out more money, they'll lower the discount rate, charge Bank of America less to borrow from the Fed, and they'll turn around and charge us less and lend more. Finally, the most likely thing to happen is open market operations. This is when the Fed either buys or sells bonds from the banking system. What they're doing is they're going up to the banking system, and if they buy bonds, They're buying a piece of paper from the banks that says that the government's going to pay them back in 10 years plus interest, because remember they're holding government debt, and handing them cash now. That's going to increase the money supply. If the Fed buys bonds, they're going to buy a piece of paper from commercial banks and hand them cash. That'll increase the money supply and cause that thing to shift to the right. And now we have a lower nominal interest rate, which means it's cheaper to borrow money. And the opportunity cost of holding your own cash on you or spending it is lower. You miss out on fewer interest payments when you go keep cash on you, and so we're more likely to buy. We're incentivized to buy more stuff. The Fed would probably do this during a recession. If the Fed wanted to decrease the money supply, they would sell bonds. They would sell government debt, pieces of paper that says the government's going to pay you back. They sell it to the banking system and remove cash from the banks now. That way the banks can't lend that money out. Money supply decreases, interest rate goes up, and that might happen to get out of an inflationary period. All right, so that's the basics of the money market. Join me again next time when we go through some examples of how the Fed would fix recessions and inflationary gaps using monetary supply. Goodbye, children.